Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. This is an episode entitled Jesus and the This Generation Controversy, involving Matthew 24, verses 34 and 36. And we're going to show you that Christian scholars and people of such eminence as C.S. Lewis have admitted that Jesus made a mistake here, and he didn't prophesy correctly that something would have happened in a generation. And by making that concession, Jewish critics have pounced on that and said, see, Christ was a failed prophet and we lose Christianity. So this is not a small issue at all. Now, I'm going to show you a defense, comes right out of the Syriac Sinaiticus, and therefore it's never been argued before this way. So this is another reason why the Syriac Sinaiticus is so valuable to us. So to remind you who that and what this is about, let me just go into that for a second. As we've discussed in other episodes, the two sisters, the heirs to a very major fortune, Agnes and her sister, decided to learn the Syriac language and go after manuscripts that would be in the Syriac language instead of the Greek, which Tischendorf had done in the 1840s. Now they're going to do in later time period what they thought was more likely the language that the apostles knew, which it turned out this led into a manuscript much older paleographically than any other that's ever been known in Christendom. But it was only of the four Gospels, just so we're clear. So it's not the entire Bible. Anyway, the variants of the Syriac Sinaiticus palimpsest is what they found. And it looks like this. Look how high quality that is. When you photograph it, it would bring out the lettering. And they paleographically dated to 150-180 AD, which means if you gave me a copy of the King James Bible, even though it's written on paper, printed in 2001, the paper may be pretty modern, but I wouldn't conclude it's written in 2001. I would say, oh, wait a minute, it has the letter TH at the end of a lot of words, and it has a vocabulary different than our own today. So therefore, I would conclude this is paleographically written in 1611, even though the page I'm looking at is 2001. So that's or 2010, whatever the date is on this, the publishing date doesn't prove to me when those words were penned. They were penned in 1611. So that's paleographically dating the Syriac language here to the era when this kind of spellings and these kind of letter formations were made in the 150-180 AD period. Agnes Lewis explains that in a successive book. But she put together the translation in 1896. Her second book did a retranslation again of the Syriac Sinaiticus. And Syriac means in the language of the Syriac language. And people think, well, it says Sinaiticus. Isn't that the Codex Sinaiticus? No, it's not the Codex Sinaiticus. Sinaiticus, that is Greek, and that was found by Tischendorf in the 1840s. And that text dates to paleographically and physically to the 350s to the 400 period. Okay, so this is the oldest text to look at. Now let's take a look at what it says and helps resolve this generation controversy. I forgot to mention that these two sisters went to Cambridge University, became scholars of the Syriac language at that university, and then brought with them to the Sinai Peninsula in the 1890s three of the top scholars in the Syriac language. They knew what they were going after, and they went to the same monastery that Tischendorf had gone after and only took the Greek text. He didn't take the Syriac text. They came to get the Syriac texts, and they did photographic plates before they left, and they didn't even know what they had until they got back to England, which shows you they were compelled to be objective because it was all physically photographed. All right, so now let's begin our episode. So let's take a look at the controversy. The controversy is about this word generation here. And Syriac Sinaiticus, according to Agnes Lewis, has a secondary meaning of tribe, which is here has to be the primary meaning because of what we're going to read in verse 36, that the hour knoweth no man but the Father only. So if Jesus is making a prophecy of what's going to happen in the future, and if he said this generation shall not pass until all things, he says, will be, this prophecy of his return or the prophecy of the fall of the temple, if he's saying that's all going to happen in one generation, 40-year period, well, then that would make him a false prophet, because we didn't have a universal return wherever I see Jesus on earth, right? So if it's tribe, though, it's totally satisfactory because it says this tribe of the Jewish people shall not pass till all these things shall be. So even the return of Christ has to happen before that tribe can pass out of what? Continuing to create new generations, and therefore it's no longer a people group. It'll be merged with all people. Okay, and there's no more giving and taking in marriage and all that stuff we all should know from the Bible. Anyway, so let's read this now with that frame of reference before we begin, and let's see what it says. Verily I say unto you, this tribe shall not pass till all these things shall be. Heaven and earth shall pass away, and my word shall not pass away. But of that day and of that hour knows no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but the Father only. That's the only verse, that's the only meaning that makes sense, tribe, because Jesus could be talking about a future, the tribe existing until the end of time and till generations cease. And therefore, he doesn't have to know what day or hour it is. He just has to know that's all these events that he's prophesying have to occur before that event happens. That much he knows, and that's it. So this is the solution that later Christians, even Christians like C.S. Lewis, are going to admit that Jesus made a mistake, which is a wrong solution here. And again, Jewish critics have used it to exploit, to say Jesus is a false prophet. Therefore, why are you following this false prophet? That's their question. And I'm going to say, no, I'm sorry. We found a Bible that's very clear. It's in the Hebraic language, the Syriac language. Therefore, this was the original view of Matthew of the passage. And it had that meaning that avoids this problem that you are trying to exploit, and that C.S. Lewis wrongfully conceded. All right, so let's begin. What problems does Jesus' statement, this generation, pose, and what 100% of Protestant translations to this day utilize except the Godbey of 1902? So the translation of generation exists in every Protestant version of the Bible except the 1902 Godbey. Okay? What solutions are there for the 99.9% of the Protestant Bibles? Relying upon the 99.99% of Protestant translations, for example, the King James Version, it is claimed by Christianity critics that Jesus' prophecy that he would return in their generation never happened, proving Jesus is a false prophet. Is this true? This article canvasses the different views and concludes that the passage has likely been mistranslated into English, making it appear a contradiction exists. Hence, this claim of a contradiction is an insubstantial one and thus no basis to discredit Jesus. The standard dilemma, temple destruction tied to events seen by this generation. Some Jewish critics of Jesus claim he could not be a prophet because he expected his return in one generation's time, 40 years approximately. See Gerald Friedlander, The Jewish Sources of the Sermon on the Mount, 1911, at pages 250 to 251. Now, by the way, 1896 was when the text was found by Agnes Lewis and her translation made, so he apparently missed that. This is repeated frequently by modern critics of Jesus of the Jewish persuasion. This is a reference to a statement by Jesus just a few days before his death. In this, Jesus delivered to his disciples a prophecy concerning the series of calamities that would befall Jerusalem and the world at the time when the temple would be destroyed, and at the time this present world would end. So he's covering two events, Jesus is. This prophecy is known as the Olivet Discourse because Jesus delivered it to his disciples privately on the Mount of Olives to the east of Jerusalem. It is recorded in Matthew 24, verse to 25, Mark 13, and Luke 21. In the Olivet Discourse, Jesus answered two questions that his disciples had asked him. When would the temple be destroyed? And two, what is the sign people should expect that will herald the end of the world and the return of Christ? The juxtaposition of the two questions in Matthew and the two answers has led readers to assume that they are asking about the same general time, and thus the answer is supposedly about the same general time. That was an assumption in the questions, but it is not necessarily present in the answer. Could be, but not necessarily. Clearly, it was an assumption evident in the expectation of disciples that both events are near to one another. That is, that the temple's destruction, which Jesus had just said is going to happen, would happen around the same time as the second coming of Christ. And you can compare Acts 1, 6-7 and John 21, verses 20 to 23 about those kind of expectations. Matthew 24, verse 36. Now let's listen to this. So this is the background in order to know what was the meaning. Was it tribe, people group, or was it a generation of 40 years? And that would be the limit that Jesus' prophecy had to be fulfilled, okay, of both events. Let's continue. Matthew 24, 36. Jesus elsewhere says he does not know the day or hour of his return. Only the Father knows. So the translation of this Genea as this generation rather than this people would have Jesus contradict himself in Matthew 24, for what Jesus says in Matthew 24, 36, two verses after this generation is mentioned. What does it say? Two verses later. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Same thing in New Living, same thing in English Standard. But again, the Syriac Sinaiticus only has it this way. but not the angels of heaven, but the Father only. Instead, these all have not nor the Son, nor the Son. So that was somebody adding that as an interpretation, but it's implied anyway here. The Father only excludes the Son automatically, right? All right, so that is the a good rebuttal here is to say, hey, he admits he didn't even know, therefore you can't construe the word Genea in Greek even to mean only the word generation of a 40-year period. Instead, it can mean Genea can mean a people group, as we'll see. So let's take a look at that. Now, in 1902, one person did have it correct, a Protestant background, and that was Godbey in the Godbey New Testament, 1902. Reverend W.B. Godbey, he died in 1920. He was the office of the God's Revivalist, Cincinnati, Ohio. So praise God for that man, but nobody followed him. Every Protestant Bible went the other way, leaving Jesus looking like he doesn't know what he's talking about. And I just want to remind you, Luther believed that Paul was superior to Jesus in terms of prophecy, and the Jesus of earth did not know, was behind Paul in knowing that the law was going to be done away with, because the Jesus of earth in Matthew 5:17-19 said the law will not go away until the heavens and earth pass away. Okay, so this idea of allowing the Protestant Bibles, the way they set it up is Jesus had to be a false teacher because he didn't even know that this generation wasn't going to have all these events, including his second coming, all happening in one generation. So there's your, if you ask me, a bias towards Paul to leave Jesus looking like he's ignorant, because that's what Luther said in the preface to the New Testament, that Jesus is behind Paul in terms of knowing that the law was to be done away with. But I digress. Let's continue. So I'm going to go back over what I said before. Clearly, it was an assumption evident in the expectation of disciples that both events, Jesus' second coming and the destruction of the temple, are near to one another, that the temple's destruction would happen around the same time as the second coming of Christ. However, it may be that the two time periods are connected by many commentators by a hasty assumption in reading the passage. Jesus very well did not likely mean to connect his second coming to the temple destruction prophecy. However, for purposes of this article, we will indulge in that common assumption because there are other significant solutions that more easily resolve this issue. Thus, as many read the passage, and as critics who claim Jesus is a false prophet read it, Jesus supposedly leads his disciples to believe his prophecies of calamities would take place at the same time the temple would be destroyed, which event took place obviously in 70 AD. The Romans sieged Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. This is the key quote. This is where they're all referring and relying upon the critics and the Pauline defenders that concede Jesus didn't know what he was talking about. Verily, verily, I say unto you, this generation, that's the standard translation 99.90% of the time, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Matthew 24, verse 34. You'll find that in the KJV, ESV, NIV, and 100% of Protestant Bibles except the Godbey of 1902. Verily I say unto you that this generation shall not pass till all these things be done. Mark 13, verse 30. Same issue, same words, same mistranslation, in my opinion. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. Luke 21:32. Same word, same Greek, same mistranslation, I contend. Was that a false prophecy? How could it be that this generation would see the end times calamities, including Christ's return, which necessarily is in the future? Yet the temple was destroyed almost 2,000 years ago. How can all these things, temple destruction and Christ's return, both have taken place in this generation when one of the two prophecies has taken place 2,000 years ago, but not the other? Clearly, Jesus was not seen by every eye on earth, right? Tell me where that's ever happened. Do we have a record of it happening in China? Because that's part of earth, right? No, the answer is no. It never happened in China. It didn't happen in any other place. There's no proof of this ever happening. Therefore, it could not possibly be the correct translation of this passage. That's where the Syriac Sinaiticus comes in. That's also where even the Greek word has the same ambiguity between generation of 40 years and the time and a people group. Let's continue reading. Let's read this first. A Jewish critic who believes Jesus is a false prophet argues thusly, quote, Jesus explicitly describes his second coming. Quote, at that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. Matthew 24:30. It will involve suffering, never to be equaled again. Matthew 24:21. This did not happen when the temple was destroyed. See, it had to happen in the same generation. That's what he's assuming, because that's how it's been translated by 99.9% of the Protestant translations, except the Godbey of 1902. There are two traditional Protestant rebuttal explanations. First, the Preterist view, which says all these things did happen in Jesus' generation, i.e. 40 years from his death, including Christ's private return. But this is flawed because the Preterist view requires an invisible coming, which Jesus denied is how he will return. Matthew 24:26-27. The second explanation is the Futurist explanation, which says Jesus meant, quote, this generation as the one alive in the future. A Jewish critic rebuts this, saying, quote, the idea that Jesus is referring to a future generation fails too. Throughout this speech, Jesus refers to his audience as you when Jesus says, when you see, verse 15. So this is easy to rebut that one. The you see is not in reference to an event that Jesus is talking about his return, but rather the events of the temple destruction that we soon, and they must take precaution when you see those events about to approach. This you see is taken out of context of what Jesus was referring to, and hence was misleading and hence false. So this is not true, just by reading the context. Now let's continue. Genea used as genos to mean people, race, or nation. This is the solution that works even in Greek, not just in the Syriac Sinaiticus. However, Jared Olar summarizes a third view. Now, I just want to tell you, Jared Olar is just a layman, okay? And he's just looking at the dictionary definitions of this that even the scholars wouldn't rely upon to defend Christ. The Protestant scholars were willing to throw Jesus under the bus for some reason. And my position is there's no other explanation that they want him to look foolish compared to Paul. Paul is so much greater than Jesus. We have to make Jesus look like he has a failed prophecy. However, Jared Olar summarized the third view. What if, when Jesus used the word generation, Greek genea, he didn't mean the same thing we mean? What if he wasn't using generation to refer to a group of people all living at the same period of history, meaning a 40-year period? Now, he just throws that out as a possibility, but I want to show you how now, if you dig deep, Mr. Olar has a good point. According to Archer, sometimes genea or generation was used as a synonym of genos, race, stock, nation, people. Archer writes, although this meaning for Genea is not common, it is found as early as Homer and Herodotus and as late as Plutarch. Plutarch wrote in the 200 AD period, by the way. Compare H.G. Liddell and R. Scott, a Greek-English lexicon, 9th edition, 1940, page 342. And this is all then cited by Gleason and Gleason L. Archer in Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, Zondervan, 1982, at page 338 to 339. This is not a concocted viewpoint. Indeed, the English word generation has a similar alternative meaning, or at least did so prior to 1908. The 1908 Webster defines generation to mean, besides meaning a 40-year period, as follows: race, kind, family, breed, stock. So it actually appears that the very word that's used in the Syriac, the word in Greek, and the word in English can both mean generation and a people group. So it's unusual that we Christians have allowed 99.9% of our Bibles to depict Jesus as a false prophet. What is going on here? What in the world can explain any of this, my friends, except what I've told you? It's a Pauline bias to make Jesus fit what Luther said in his preface to the New Testament in 1522, that Jesus was behind Paul, who was the one who knew that the law was fading away. And that's also in the Luther works on his discussions with other people about Jesus' knowledge is inferior to Paul's. Let's continue. Genea, literal meaning. The Greek word genea, translated generation here, does also mean the offspring of a common human ancestor. Thayer's Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament provides the following definitions of this word: a beginning, birth, nativity. 2, that which has been begotten, men of the same stock or a family. 2a, the several ranks of natural descent, the successive members of a genealogy. 2b, a metaphor, a group of men very likely each other in endowments, pursuits, or character. 2b1, especially in a bad sense, of a first nation. 3, the whole multitude of men living at the same time. Now that's what the concession by these Christian scholars, the 99.9% of the translations are all, I believe, theologically driven to make Jesus look like he doesn't know what he's talking about in the Protestant Bibles. 4, an age, i.e. the time ordinarily occupied by each successor generation, a space of 30 to 33 years. Now, I believe it's more 40 years. That's the general consensus of what generation means. Thus, if Jesus was correctly translated as Genea, only if meanings 3 and 4 apply does a contradiction by Jesus of his own words emerge. Otherwise, if the more generic meaning of numbers 1 and 2 apply, there is no contradiction by Jesus of himself or a false prophecy. All right, so now let's look at this next section here. Early church leaders and commentators concurred on Genea has a generic meaning in this passage, meaning it can mean either a generation of a 40-year period approximately or a people group like Jews or the human race. In fact, Venerable Bede, he lived and wrote in the 600s and early 700s. Many centuries ago, he already recognized this meaning in the text. Bede says this, quote, by generation, he, Jesus, either means the whole race of mankind or especially the Jews. Okay, and this shows up. I just have to point this out to you. This is in the Catena Aurea, Golden Chain, done by Thomas Aquinas, and it's called right here. You can find this in a book from Rivington, London, 1842. And Thomas Aquinas wrote in his commentary on Mark 4, verse 42. And when Thomas Aquinas was born? 1224, 1225, approximately. So he's writing in the 1200s. The person he's citing wrote in the 600s and maybe 700s, early 700s. And this is well known in the church is what this word meant here. It didn't mean a generation of 40 years. And yet 99% of our Bibles get it wrong and make Jesus look like a false prophet. What's going on? Something's wrong. Something needs to be fixed in these people's approach to Jesus. And just to show you who Bede was, Bede the Venerable, born 672, 673. So basically a short time before, relatively short. Thomas Aquinas is 1224. So this is a guy about 500, 600 years earlier. And he was an Anglo-Saxon theologian, historian, and chronologist, and so on and so forth. And let's continue. Another example is Theophylactus, wrote between 1055 and 1085 AD, that he saw Jesus meant the generation of Christians. So that's another way of looking at it. Generation of Jews, generations of Jews or Christians, that people group. And he writes this in 1055 and 1085, one or the other. Or else this generation shall not pass away. That is the generation of Christians until all things be fulfilled, which were spoken concerning Jerusalem and the coming of Antichrist. For he does not mean the generation of the apostles, for the greater part of the apostles did not live up to the destruction of Jerusalem. But he says this of the generation of Christians, wishing to console his disciples, lest they should believe that the faith should fail at that time. For the immovable elements shall first fail before the words of Christ fail. Wherefore it is added, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. Again, this is in that same book by Aquinas. Here it is, Catena Aurea, Golden Chain, Parallel Gospel of Matthew, so on and so forth. John Henry Parker, Rivington, London, 1842, if you want to look it up. Finally, Jerome, an early church leader translator of Greek and Hebrew from about 400 AD, believed that Jesus was referencing to the offspring of man, and in particular to the offspring of Jews in Matthew 24:34. By the way, how long ago did someone realize this already? Duh. I mean, it's just such an obvious thing. And how can 99.9% of all Protestant Bibles except the Godbey get this wrong? I can't understand it, my friends. Can't figure this out. Why they would do this, except what I've given you as a suggestion. This is a Pauline. You're reading theologically driven Paulinists who are willing to throw Jesus under the bus because it makes Paul look superior to Jesus because he knows what's really going on, apparently. By generation, here means the whole human race, Jerome says, and the Jews in particular. And he adds, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away, to confirm their faith in what has gone before, as though he had said, it is easier to destroy things solid and immovable than that aught should fail of my words. And again, this is Thomas Aquinas put all these things together long ago. It's not like you had to dig this stuff up. There was a scholar that his works have been very remnant, meaning they've survived, and he puts these all together. He created an catena, a chain of citations so that we could do this work easily by just reading what he had. Amazing. And yet our translators don't know this? How dense can they possibly be? Let's continue. Surely, if this scholarly translator of Greek and Hebrew, Jerome, who lived much closer to the time of the New Testament than we, took Jewish people or the entire human race as the meaning of Genea in Matthew 24, verse 34, we should also seriously consider this interpretation. I'm just being nice. No, it's mandatory here. In context, it makes no sense to be anything else. Thus, Jesus' words might be rendered, this people, i.e. the Jews of the church, they shall not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. And that rendering, Jesus would have been referring to the Jewish people or to the church, for both Israel and the church are given divine promises that they would remain in existence until the end of time. Jeremiah 31, verses 35 to 37, and Matthew 16, verse 18. The you to whom Jesus spoke then are the national racial you rather than you, the few people listening. Thus, that you was as much present 2,000 years ago as such you is still with us today. Hence, this prophecy can still be in the future, and Jesus addressed this to you in the generic sense of Jews or the church. Genea is solely 40 years of offspring, so that's the alternative. Let's take a look at that. However, an opposing view of Genea is set forth in the Wikipedia on the second coming. So they're going to take no, they're basically going to take no prisoners. They're not going to give any concession that there's any other meaning than a 40-year period. So just so you know, bias goes even now. Now the Christians, Protestants, the 99% versions that mistranslated to make Jesus look inferior is now going to be exploited by Wikipedia. By the way, Wikipedia does not mention this third view, meaning the view of Jerome, Bede, and Theophylact, suggesting a lack of objectivity in Wikipedia's article. And it says this Wikipedia article argues that, quote, if Jesus meant race, he would have used Genos, race, not Genea, generation. And the answer to that is no, that's not necessarily so. As we've shown you, Genea can have that secondary meaning just like it has in Syriac and such as other languages such as English. No explanation is given for this assertion, let alone any explanation why there is no synonymous use of Genea as sometimes to have the same meaning as Genos, as Archer says, and just as English likewise has for the word generation. The Wikipedia instead sidesteps this, citing the typical definition of Genea, but ignoring that it sometimes was a synonym for Genos or race. This portion of Wikipedia reads, quote, this is a quote, the Bauer lexicon, since updated by Arndt and Gingrich, and then it gives you the site, 1952, 153, of a Koine Greek states that Genea means, no other explanation given to you, the sum total of those born at the same time, expanded to include all those living at a given time, generation, contemporary. So Jesus is only talking about the people alive then. See? So Jesus is a false prophet according to Wikipedia. According to the 99.9% of the Protestant Bibles all agree with the Wikipedia. Why would they do that? And have been doing it for centuries, my friend. Robinson's Greek and English lexicon states that Genea means, quote, the interval of time between father and son, from 30 to 40 years, those living in any period of time, this present generation. Now, I believe if we went through all these lexicons, we'd find there's another alternative meaning, but Wikipedia isn't going to give that to us, so don't count on it. The Greek meaning of Genea is, to the contrary, expansive enough in usage to mean people, race, etc. In such a case, the contradiction disappears, suggesting that too much emphasis is put by Wikipedia on the ordinary meaning of Genea to create a contradiction. Moreover, in 1896, Agnes Lewis translated the Syriac Sinaiticus to mean either tribe or generation, as in 40-year time period. In other words, the Syriac language had that variability. It could mean a single generation of 40 years or a tribe, a people group. Thus, a legitimate way to read Jesus is that this people or tribe shall not pass away or will continue to exist until all these things be fulfilled. All right? So just showing you the other side of the coin. If you read Wikipedia, it's all over. Jesus is a false prophet. End of story. 99.9% of the Protestant Bibles all agree. You'd have to go back to the Godbey of 1902 to try to defend Jesus, and you're done. And they don't mention the Syriac Sinaiticus. They don't mention anything, and you're done. Jesus is done if you read Wikipedia. C.S. Lewis admits error by Jesus. And can we defend ourselves? No, not according to C.S. Lewis. We're wrong. Jesus is an error. C.S. Lewis despaired at finding a solution to this passage. Lewis reluctantly conceded to the assertion of the skeptics that Jesus was in error. He attributed this to the supposedly limited knowledge Jesus had in his incarnate human form. He despairingly wrote, say what you like, we shall be told by some critics the apocalyptic beliefs of the first Christians have been proved to be false. It is clear from the New Testament that they all expected the second coming in their own time. And I'm going to just say here, not Jesus, because only the Father knows when. So he disavowed that. And that's how you can construe he didn't mean generation. He meant tribe, which means it's a generic term that will go on for, as long as there's generations on earth. So he was clearly leaving it open that he didn't know. And therefore, since he doesn't know and only Father knows, how could he say this generation, 40 years? That would mean he knows no. But he said he didn't know. Therefore, again, that's why we know this is a mistranslation, even in the 99.9% of the Bibles in the Protestant world that mistranslated as generation, incredibly. And worse still, they had reason, and one which you will find very embarrassing. Now, this is C.S. Lewis saying it's a fact. We can't disavow this. Their master had told them so. Jesus had told them it's going to be in this generation, not this generation will continue until the heavens and earth disappear. He's basically conceding that Jesus is false. He shared and indeed created their delusion. Jesus created their delusion, their false belief that he was coming soon. He was coming in that generation. He said in so many words, this generation shall not pass till all these things be done. And he was wrong. Jesus was wrong if you listen to C.S. Lewis. Why did the Pauline Christians want to believe Jesus was wrong? And you can know from your heart, there's no other explanation. It's Paul becomes superior to Jesus if you can prove Jesus was wrong. And they're very happy to tell you Jesus was wrong. But they've ignored the fact that if Jesus was wrong, he can't be Messiah, he can't be anything. He's a false prophet. So goodbye, Jesus. Why do these people do this? They so love Paul, they'll destroy Jesus. This has to stop. He clearly knew no more about the end of the world than anyone else. This is C.S. Lewis. It continues. By the way, it comes out of an article, The World's Last Night, 1960, The Essential C.S. Lewis at 385. I owned this book, so I read this myself. Lewis continues, it is certainly the most embarrassing verse in the Bible. Yet how teasing also that within 14 words of it should come the statement, but of that day and that hour knows no man, no, not the angels which are in heaven, neither the Son, but the Father. The one exhibition of error and the one confession of ignorance grow side by side. And he doesn't put two and two together. If he says he doesn't know, then he isn't affirming he knows in the other. And there is an alternative, Mr. Lewis, if you had just studied Greek. I told you, Genea has this ambiguity. It can be either a people group or it can be a generation of 40 years. Same as in Syriac. Syriac says it can be a tribe or it can a people or it can be a generation of time, 40 years. This is C.S. Lewis again, The World's Last Night, 1960, The Essential C.S. Lewis at 385. He does no favor to us, does he? Everybody says, oh my gosh, what a wonderful scholar. He's fallen in line with the 99.9% of the Bibles that throw Jesus under the bus. I don't like that. Do you? I include this to demonstrate a problem for which I suggest a better choice. Instead of admitting Jesus made a mistake, as C.S. Lewis does, it is better to say either A, the translation should be adjusted as outlined above, obviously, or B, insist the issue is unresolvable against Jesus because of potential issues of transmission error, translation error, etc. In other words, if we had to admit an error, it does not mean the error originated with Jesus. I would not have taken C.S. Lewis's course unless there were substantial reasons from other verses to believe Jesus was in error about many things. To the contrary, as the context reveals, Jesus was correct about many things, including his prophecy that the temple would be destroyed. I mean, there's an amazing prophecy that we're ignoring. Okay. Time of the Gentiles quote. Now, I'm going to show you a passage in Luke that corroborates that Jesus had no idea that the temple would be the only time period he's talking about, that generation. He's talking about a much longer period of time when he spoke about Genea. In the Lucan amplification of the Matthew Discourse, a long period lies between the destruction of Jerusalem and the apocalyptic events which precede his second coming. Luke 21, verse 24, they will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So that's a long period of time, it sounds like, right? This supports reading the 2 points as distinct. The temple destruction is a long time prior to the time of the Gentiles. That seems obvious, right? Hence, this also supports that Genea was used as Genos in this passage. As Archer says, there are several examples in Greek literature of this usage, right? I showed you Homer, right? And Hesiod. These are famous people in Greek literature. They use the word Genea in both ways, and that's what the Wikipedia didn't tell you about. It also supports why we should turn to Agnes's loose translation from the Syriac, a Hebraic Aramaic language the apostles were writing and speaking in, rather than Greek, which it is impossible to imagine was Matthew's original record of the Gospels, and which repeatedly was said to be the first in Hebrew, first Gospel, which was in Hebrew, which can be translated readily into Aramaic by virtually identical vocabulary. Conclusion. We have canvassed pros and cons and hopefully demonstrate that those who insist upon a contradiction are not being reasonable in reading Jesus' words in their Greek translation in context of Jesus saying, no one knows the day or the hour but the Father only. No one has the duty to be charitable to Jesus, yet when I see the otherwise brilliant and witty words of Jesus, as well as his fulfillment of the Tanakh role of Messiah, besides the competing textual clues that the temple talk and the return talk are not actually connected, the better view is that this is not a contradiction. There are reasonable interpretations that maintain a consistency. Try to find fault elsewhere if you wish. This is not conclusive and not a strong proof. In fact, using the Syriac Sinaiticus of 1896, it is a wrong reading. All right, God bless everybody. I hope that helps you if you have to defend the honor of Jesus against all the 99.9% of the Christian Bibles, Protestant Bibles that concede he's in error. I suggest just put that to one side and just try to convince someone to look at the Syriac Sinaiticus. It came along after the 1611 mistranslation in the King James Bible. And so there is a myth, a theological assumption that the King James Bible is without error. It's biblical inerrancy taken on steroids, that even human beings who are just translators can't make mistakes. And that's why we are left leaving Jesus on a limb where he can be called a false prophet with validity, because our Bibles all have it wrong. And we're stubbornly sticking with the King James Bible no matter how bad a translation it was. It's unbelievable that we do that. Or are we trying to feed into the 1522 solution of Luther that Jesus is behind Paul in knowledge and he was ignorant that the law is being done away with and Paul was superior to Jesus? Is that why we're doing this? There's multiple reasons why this could be going on, but try to keep the conversation stuck on the Syriac Sinaiticus, which basically trumps everything because that came along later, clarified the King James Bible was wrong in its translation into English, and the word tribe or people group or the people of Jews or even Christians could be what Jesus meant. The people of God will be there until he returns, until that second coming happens. All right, God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.